Hi, welcome back to the glory of God in mathematics. Today we're going to continue by looking at math skills or concepts and how we can use them and teach them from a biblical worldview. So today's topic is exponential growth. Now, this is something that perhaps is a little higher level topic, but I typically teach it to students as young as 10. So it doesn't have to be that your student is in high school or your child's in high school for you to hit this area. Exponential growth, we're going to look at the screen in just a second here, is actually a really basic mathematical concept. If you can get past perhaps your public school background or just your textbook background of thinking of it in very complicated terms. So exponential growth is the idea that we multiply as we move forward. So multiply to get the next number. We'll just write some data up on the screen so that you can get an idea of the math. And then I'll come back through and talk about it in an actual context so you can kind of see where this happens in life and maybe start to extrapolate and think of other areas where this appears. So if we are going to do exponential growth and we want to produce a data set, let's just assume, see, it's so hard for me to talk about it and not actually have it be situated in an actual context. Let's just say we're talking about time. We won't give this any units. I'm going to focus on the math first. If I start out with one item, and let's say I'm going to multiply by 10. That's my exponential growth factor. Then in the next unit of time, 1 times 10 is 10. And the next unit of time, 10 times 10 is 100. And the next unit of time, 100 times 10 is 1,000, right? And we just repeat this process. We get to 10,000 and we get to 100,000. This is exponential growth because each time we move forward, we have massively increased in amount. Let's just look at, what is the difference between 10 and 1? We increased by 9 units. What about between 10 and 100? Well, that's 90 units. What about 100 and 1,000? Well, that's 900 units. You see how this pattern goes? So we're adding a significantly greater amount each time we move forward. And if we were to put this on a graph, which is a fantastic tool that we use to help us see numbers that our brains sometimes can't quite comprehend in data table form, we just simply put it to a graph. We got to go all the way up to 100,000 here, which means 1,000 falls right about there. And 100 falls right about there. So you can see very quickly this graph is going to be a little tricky to see. We're going to start out almost flat, barely moving, moving a little bit more now. And then we end way out. Now this, of course, is just eyeballed. It's not actually correct and perfectly to scale, but it still allows us to see the trend. We have a pretty sharp curve that eventually becomes a perfectly straight up and down line. So this is an exponential growth curve. So you can always take a data table and plot it. You can use computer programs to help you do that and see it. When you see this pattern, starting point, kind of curves, and then goes straight up, that's an exponential growth. So this is how you get to that mathematically. But let's come back through it in terms of a context real quickly, just so you can see where you might encounter this in life, and then we'll talk about how we answer the 3 questions. So let's say that we're looking at bacterial growth. And we're looking at it on a counter that you have just used to slice up raw chicken. So we're going to go over here and we'll look at time. And for Salmonella, E. coli, it's typically 20 minutes at room temperature for them to double. And so this will be their population. And their growth factor is doubling in 20 minutes. Now we're not going to put clock times on here because that makes the math a little more complex. So we'll just say at the beginning, you chopped up your chicken, you did all of the things. Now, it's not like it's saturated with salmonella, but there's a bit on there. So let's say after doing all of your kitchen work, you walked away for whatever weird reason, didn't sanitize your counters. You have maybe 10 cells of bacteria, which is actually a very moderate amount. You're looking at so few cells, you still actually can't even notice them in a microscope. There's so few of them. 10 cells. Okay, 20 minutes later, so this is in minutes. If we're doubling, you now have 20 cells. Well, not the end of the world. Like I said, 10 is a very conservative amount. At the 40-minute mark, we have double that number, 40. At the 1 hour mark, 60 minutes, right? Double 40, we have 80. Then we go to the 1 hour and 20 minutes, double 80. We have now 160 cells. Still seems not too bad, right? We get to 1 hour, 40 minutes, double that again. Now have 320 cells, and this is where it starts to get crazy. We hit now the 2 hour mark, and we have 640 cells. In 20 minutes, we'll have over 1,000 cells, and by the 4 hour mark, we have 1 million. This is exponential growth. You can probably already begin to imagine in your mind some of the scenarios to which this information might be very valuable. But before we jump into that, I want to go ahead and take away the screen and let's talk through the answers to our 3 questions. So, as we look at teaching our children about math and about patterns that we see in nature, which is all exponential growth is, in fact, patterns that God commands in scriptures, which we'll speak about in a minute, we see very clearly that there's a way to do this biblically and there's a way not. Not, I can just talk through that and you can immediately jump to all the practical applications that there are of knowing that information. But let's back it up for a minute. Why do bacterial cells reproduce by multiplying? Why does any living thing multiply? Plants, people. What does the Bible call that? And why is that the way that it is? As parents, especially moms, homeschool moms we're talking to here specifically, a lot of the times we struggle making the biblical connection because we haven't stopped to ask really good questions ourselves. And my toddlers call it the why tunnel because once they hit that, 2, 3 age, they start asking you why 9 million times. You need to go back into the why tunnel as a mom. And that's where you're going to find the answer to your biblical worldview connections and why we need to learn this. So as we why tunnel our way through this, okay, we see this in living things. Why do we see this in living things? Wait, is it all living things? Yeah, it is. Why? Go to Genesis. Guess what? In Genesis chapter 1, God commands the plants to be fruitful and what's the word? King James says multiply. Ah, ding, ding, ding. That's exponential growth. He gives the same command to the animals and repeats the same command to Adam and Eve. And then again, post-flood, he repeats the command to Noah and the animals who've left the ark. So we see a continuation through all of history that God is a God of fruitfulness, productivity, and work that produces something that bears fruit, that results in more and greater than what it was before, is part of God's nature and character. That's an important question to answer and understand as we look at so many adult questions about life, so many issues of morality, and so many just practical pieces of our world since He's the God who created it. But before we jump there, let's go to question number 2. How do we rightly understand mankind in light of this truth? Well, we have to understand that mankind currently is under the curse of sin because of Adam's fall. And so that means that both us and all creation are cursed by sin. If God is a God of fruitfulness and productivity, then sin is going to cause death and barrenness and lack of productivity. Both naturally, that's a consequence because Adam sinned, and internally, your flesh is going to desire barrenness and lack of productivity. Now, it won't say it to you that way, right? Your mind is never like, oh, I don't want any fruit this year. Instead, it comes out as laziness and selfishness. Isn't it true? If we're very fruitful as a family, we have lots of children to care for. You cannot be a selfish mother of 12 children and have that go well. And so instead, we say, oh, I don't want to be that selfless. Maybe I'll stop at just one kid or just two. This is the modern American selfish mindset. Likewise with productivity, right? Productivity requires work. You want to get more out, you have to put more in. It's basic math. But we don't want to work harder. We don't want to work more. We want to work less. We want the 3-day weekend to be codified into law. We want labor laws to say I only have to work, 6 hours a day instead of the typical. Well, what does God prescribe? You work 6 hours, or sorry, 6 days, 6 days a week, not 7, 6, but also not 5, and certainly not 4. And so we as sinful beings resist the fruitfulness and productivity that God has for us. And so that's something that we have to consider. And math can be a springboard to that lesson where we talk about ourselves and our internal desires and how we have to fight against that. What does God want for us? What's his way? So then we come to our last question, why? Why, A, do I need to learn the specific math principle, and B, the broader principle of fruitfulness and productivity? Well, you probably have a million answers to the second question, but the first one maybe not as much, which is why we come to specific examples. When math is taught in isolation from its real world context, it is hard to think about what is the reason we needed to learn this. But once you situate it rightly in its natural world context, then it's quite easy to figure it out. So the first thing we have to understand is because God has commanded all living things, plants, bacteria, yeast, human beings, animals, all to be fruitful and multiply, that God's command for life is to produce exponential growth. So we have to understand it, A, just because that's how all life in the world works. You are life and you are surrounded by life and you eat life. And so you have to understand that's how life works. Otherwise, you're going to fall prey to a whole bunch of crazy ideas that are currently circulating out there in America and beyond about overpopulation, about lack of food, about the idea that, we couldn't possibly feed this many people, about what bacteria cells do and don't do in rebel canning jars. All of these questions are answered by understanding the mathematical principle of exponential growth and that all living things have been commanded and called to it. Another one is that we can predict this. So there are specific mathematical patterns to exponential growth that if we study each organism long enough, we watch and track its population, we can figure out what the math is for that organism, and we can then use it to predict and make safe laws and rules and regulation, eliminating unhealthy practices. We can also just use it to be wise as we farm and we ranch and we raise, animals and plants and things for our good and for the good of others in our community and for the future. And so, an example as we looked at that screen a moment ago with bacteria, I'll come back to it so we have that as a touch point here. Where did the US and Europe and all of these countries come up with the idea that once something is sat out on the counter for more than 2 hours, it should be thrown away, not put back in the refrigerator? This is where we have studied the bacteria that are responsible for foodborne illnesses, primarily Salmonella and E. coli, but there's others. We know how much they multiply times 2, how often every 20 minutes. And we have tested many times to figure out what's typical amount of bacteria after these different scenarios. And because these bacteria are present in your air and they're present on every surface, and you can't sanitize your entire home to have zero bacteria. In fact, it would be unhealthy to do so. There isn't anything I can do to say that these aren't going to multiply in my food. And so as a result, we can look at this and say, is it this conspiracy theory that the government has come up with that we should throw away our food after, 2 to 4 hours? And we can look at the math and we can look at the science and say, actually, no, it's exponential growth. See, the average person who doesn't go to this level in math or doesn't understand what they were taught, they only think in terms of linear growth. And in linear growth, it ought to be good for ages and ages. Or, even worse, they only think in terms of anecdotes. Well, I haven't personally ever got sick from doing it. I don't know anybody personally that got sick from doing it. But when you look really at your circle in the scheme of humans, it's actually quite small. Even if you know personally 200 people and you communicate with them all regularly, weekly, 200 people out of 8 billion on the planet is not a sufficient sample size. In fact, in the US, the minimum sample size for most research is 1,000 people. I don't think you communicate with, personally speak to every week 1,000 people. And in that small or larger size of group, you probably do know quite a few people who have had food poisoning. And so this is something that we can use then to rightly situate how we think about laws and things and how we avoid conspiracy theories. Now, this is just one example, and I want to throw out 2 or 3 other ideas that I would love to spend a half hour in just chatting about, but I'll try to keep it short for today. So this is an example, right, with bacterial growth, a specific application that we can know and then prepare for, right? We can prevent harm to people, prevent foodborne illness by realizing this is how bacteria grow, and this is when it's no longer probably going to be safe. And so we can also apply this to other scenarios. Yeast. I love to bake. So we don't buy anything store-bought. I bake everything from scratch, single ingredients myself, even milling the flour. So I go to that level. Not all the time, but majority of the time. And so with baking, the same exact thing is true of yeast. However, we don't have the numbers nailed out quite so well because there hasn't been a high call for research in this area. So you kind of have to figure it out for yourself at your home kitchen. But there is an exponential growth pattern to yeast as well. It depends, yes, on how much yeast you use, because the more yeast you use in your bread dough, the more cells you have to start with. And so they double from that rate. And so you have to figure out for your cells, how many of them do you need for your bread to be finished? How long does it take for them to double? And then do the math. How long will it take the bread to rise? A lot of people early on when baking bread don't understand that relationship, and they use way too much yeast or way too little yeast, or they're surprised by the rise times. It's because it's not linear, it's exponential. It's going to look like nothing's happening in that bread for a long time. But once you're starting to see the doubling, you've already hit that turning point in the exponential growth curve. And from this point forward, it's going to double in that same amount of time, but the doubling is going to be visible. So what happens is bakers will look at their loaf and it's not rising, it's not rising, it's not rising, it's not rising. And they go do something and they come back and it way overproofed and their bread starts to cave in and it's not good. Well, what happened? They're like, but it happened so fast. I was only gone for 10 minutes. Yeah, you were gone for 10 minutes. When you were here 10 minutes ago, there were only 1,000 cells, and now here 10 million, 10 minutes later, there's 1 million cells. It doubles every 10 minutes, not increases linearly. And so the closer you get to the end of the bread rising, the faster that goes. It's an exponential change in growth, not linear. And so understanding that can help us be better at baking our bread at the proper time and estimating how long it's going to take because it's not linear. We can't just say this many teaspoons of yeast equals this many hours. It's not linear. And so a third area, consider that you can use this to apply with your own children. How do we talk about why this is good to know? Is with human population. With human population, you can look Adam and Eve, 2 people. God commands them to multiply. So if we go with the most conservative number, you can multiply by 2. Multiplying by 1 is actually not multiplication, that's an identity. We'll talk about that another day. So 2 times 2 means 4 kids is the minimum to meet God's requirement to multiply, literally multiply. So 4 kids. Those 4 kids multiply times 2, you end up with 8 grandkids. Why? Because of the 4 kids, 2 had to be girls, 2 boys, marriage, 8 grandkids. Okay, keep doing this. However many years, usually 30 or 40 years is what we consider human generation in modern times. Adam and Eve's times, of course, it was much different. But you can then see exponential growth pattern for humans. And so that's something that you can use to say, well, how did we get to this number, 8 billion today? That is how it is. It's not because people are having too many babies. There's no such thing. It's just that's how God has commanded life to be. When we multiply, which is what God commanded, it's going to be an exponential, not linear growth. But we also have to combat lies of the enemy, and one of them is the whole idea that we can't feed everybody. Well, clearly we can. If you've heard myths and haven't debunked them yet, do some internet searching. There's enough food on the planet today to feed everyone. The reason some people don't have enough is government issues. So government is hoarding the money, communism, they're not giving the people the food that is produced, or they've got the people doing things that aren't producing food. Reality is, we are not the only beings on the planet that grow exponentially. All living things do. So the vegetables and fruits that we need to survive also are capable of growing exponentially. But they do require our care. If left to themselves naturally, their exponential growth is less than what we need it to be. If we will care for them and propagate them and protect and shelter them from the elements, they will grow even more. Same goes for animals that we eat. You can have an exponential growth of chickens. And so, because all things are capable of growing exponentially, and what we eat is plants and animals, which are living things, they also can grow exponentially all together and it works. So, there is no number that God has that, oh, once they hit this number, there's not enough food. God did not create the world that way. It is able to be fruitful and multiply and abound. And it is because the God who created exponential growth is the God of fruitfulness, and he designed it to be that way in the first place. And so learning about exponential growth, whether it's the function, whether it's the curve, whether it's looking at just patterns in data, this is a very key piece of understanding who God is, how he's created the world, what the common sins and pitfalls of mankind are, and what we can do about it. That's all for today.